Hello and welcome to Bristol Ideas. I'm Andrew Kelly and I'm hosting today's session. Sir Angus Deaton is the Dwight D. Eisenhower Professor of Economics and International Affairs Emeritus and Senior Scholar at Princeton University. His books include The Great Escape, Health, Wealth and the Origins of Inequality, the New York Times bestseller with Case, Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism, and the book we're talking about today, Economics in America, an immigrant economist explores the land of inequality. Economics in America brings together memoir with a lifetime of learning about economics, the United States, and inequality. In 2015, Sir Angus was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences for his analysis of consumption, poverty, and welfare. Thank you for joining us, Angus, today.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here, especially with the link with Bristol, where I've spent 7 very happy years.
Yes, we talked about that last time we met, your time in Bristol, and you're always welcome back in the city. And I was present when you came back to do a lecture. It's some years ago now, but I think it was certainly after you were awarded the Nobel Prize. When we talked last time during the pandemic, we discussed with you and with Anne Case your research and the book Deaths of Despair. And Deaths of Despair are covered extensively in the new book. It's like a thread running through all the chapters that you write. Well, what's the latest on Deaths of Despair in terms of your research?
Well, I mean, I can tell you what's actually happening with Deaths of Despair. And the news is not good. One might have thought that after the pandemic, that things would turn to other things, and this pandemic of Deaths of Despair might actually be replaced, and that unfortunately did not happen. It seems that in the very first months of the pandemic, there was some reduction in suicide rates. But the drug epidemic has gone on booming from strength to awful strength. The huge increase in alcoholic liver deaths during the pandemic, presumably, since it takes a long time for alcohol to do bad things to your liver, these were presumably people who'd been drinking a lot already, and the pandemic just, guided up. So it's not really hopeful at all, and suicide rates have resumed their upward trend, and it's one of the few countries in the world where that is true. I was looking the other day, and the countries in Eastern Europe, Russia, Hungary, Lithuania used to be the champions of suicide, and now America's catching up with them, and they're falling. Their suicide rates are falling. So it's not a good picture.
And we talked briefly last time about your fears that the United Kingdom might follow in America's the same path that America has taken. Have you got any more information on that?
There's a little bit of that, but nothing like the same size. The one place where we do see comparable things is Scotland, but not. I mean, Deaths of Despair have been rising in Britain, but they're nothing like the level that they are in the United States. You never really had this major outpouring of drugs pushed by big pharma, which then eventually led to an illegal epidemic. Scotland, of course, is different, and the numbers of deaths are much smaller because the population is much smaller, but the mortality rate from drugs is very high.
I mean, we've had, since the book came out, a whole series of other publications and also films. I watched a series recently called Painkiller about the opioid epidemic. We've had Dope Sick. We've had a very good documentary, I thought, Nan Golding's All the Beauty and the Bloodshed. Have you been involved in any of this work, consulted?
Not really. I'm trying to remember the name of the author of Dope Sick, but we corresponded with her on a fairly regular basis. But no, we haven't been involved in these things. We tried to watch, we loved the Nan Golden documentary, which was just terrific. I mean, it was a wonderful example of how one woman could stand up to these forces to actually win. Really amazing. And we watched the first episode of Painkiller, but didn't watch any more. So
I think it's
kitchen for most of the first episode.
I think it's Beth Macy, isn't it, that is the author of Dope Sick?
Of course, yeah. You know, one of the things about being 78 years old is you begin to lose the ability to recall names. But Beth Macy, indeed.
Those of us 16 years younger, Angus, suffer the same problem, I can assure you. So it's one thing that I took from both Deaths of Despair and this book was the critical importance in terms of making progress in the United States on having a degree, a 4-year education. And the gap has widened, hasn't it, since you wrote Deaths of Despair on that?
And that's what we're currently working on now. We're presenting a paper at Brookings the day after tomorrow, on Thursday, which is about that. And we have a piece coming out in the New York Times about that on Tuesday next week, a week from today. And what's happening is this gap in deaths between people who do and do not have a BA has, you know, been increasing for quite a long time, as other people have, but it's just exploded, and even more so during the pandemic. And it's not just deaths of despair, it's cardiovascular disease, which is going up for people who don't have a BA, and going down. So you've got this horrible thing, which is very unusual in the annals of mortality, which is that if you look at life expectancy at age 25 for people with and without a degree, they're actually, one of them's going up and one of them's going down. So that's just an appalling condemnation. And, you know, we've known for a long time that America was not doing very well relative to European countries, of which Britain's not a very distinguished record either. But nevertheless, it's very distinguished compared with the US. And if you take just the third of the population, the adult population that has a college degree, and put them on, you know, compare them with the European countries, they do very well. They look like Switzerland or Japan. But it's the people without a BA who've just fallen off the bottom of the flock, as it were, become completely egregious. So something terrible is really happening to those people.
We're going to come back to some of those points and also touch on healthcare. But before talking about your move to the United States and the book that you've written, I wanted to ask you something that comes up in the book, which is about what you feel is the role and responsibility of economists is. We do this annual Festival of Economics, which is about economists talking to members of the public and the public talking to economists. We try and encourage a two-way exchange so that economists can meet the public, but at the level that the public wants to engage them with. You talk in the book about economists not dealing with some of the big issues of the time. So there's two things really I want to ask you about. What do you think is the public engagement role of economists? And also, what are the issues that economists aren't dealing with, the big issues that economists aren't dealing with?
Well, it's a complicated question. And as you say, I mean, in the book, towards the end, I become perhaps more negative about the role of my profession. One of my colleagues, who's not an economist, had told me that he thought the book was a love letter to my profession, which I was very surprised about when he said that. But, you know, there is a lot of affection there, too. So I don't want to make it seem like, you know, I'm an old man who hates what's going on, what the young people are doing, because that's what usually happens to old men. And, you know, please shut up, you know, get on with departing into the sunset, and don't bother us who are doing the really good work. And I'm sensitive to that issue. I think that the other thing I want to say is this is not a book that criticizes particular economists or particular kinds of economists, though there are people there that I'm perhaps not very nice about. A lot of it is me. I think I used the phrase mea culpa at one point.
Yeah.
That, you know, we as a profession, including me, made what I now regard as we took an unfortunate position in that we were much too persuaded by the libertarians, by Milton Friedman and his colleagues, in that markets would do things that they couldn't do. And it's not that they can't do amazing things, the markets and prices and all the rest of it are, one of the miracles of the world. But you just can't expect them to do everything. And for instance, a lot of people thought that financial engineering and the way economists had thought about that had improved so much that something like the financial crisis was really not possible. And that was a pretty rude awakening. And it wasn't just Alan Greenspan who said, I was just stunned that this could happen. We thought they had this under control. I think on trade, we're rethinking a lot of our positions. I think maybe even on immigration, it's possible that economists got this wrong, at least in part. So these are big issues. These are the issues that sort of dominate politics today. And I think there are some deep things that we don't worry about too much. I think one of the deep things is we worry much too much about efficiency. So we're trying to produce more out of what we have. And that was Lionel Robbins's definition of economics, which was, the use of scarce resources among efficient ends. But that's a very narrow definition that doesn't really worry about who gets what, for instance. And that's been very important. It doesn't really, where does health fit into that picture? If GDP is going up, but people are dying in droves, do economists not have anything to say about that? And I think we should. And I think we were much too sanguine about, we were very self-congratulatory about the reductions in global poverty and worried much too little about what was happening at home, and that we're reaping some of that whirlwind now.
I mean, one of the issues you talk about that economists haven't dealt with well is climate change.
Right.
Tell us about that.
Sure, anyone's dealing very well with that. I mean, that's something that can make us very depressed very quickly, talking about that. But I think, I think economics is much more divided on that. So there are people on the right side of that. My old friend Nick Stern, who wrote about it in the book, Lord Stern as he is now, is a very, very good economist with a very distinguished record in economics, who's, been very much on the right side of that issue for a long time. But there is another set of people, who, for instance, think you should discount the future at market interest rates, which I think is really philosophically nuts. I mean, it's not as if those interest rates are achieved by a bargain between you and your unborn descendants, or us and our unborn descendants. And so I think that's just a mistake, but it's a mistake that many economists have bought into.
I mean, I can see why your colleague said it was an affectionate study of economists. I mean, it's because what shines through, I think, is the way you write about economists. And there's a wonderful chapter where you cover 3 economists, I think, or maybe it's 4, that 4 economists, which really brings their work to life, I think, and also them to life as well. And when I saw what you wrote about someone who I admired a lot and used his work a lot, Tony Atkinson, you begin to see there why your colleague had that view of your book, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, he wasn't an economist, this colleague of mine, so he probably hates economists. So, he probably, when he said I was being affectionate, it was compared with what he thinks about economists. Well, but I'm glad you liked the chapter with the little biographies, because that chapter, it originally was a letter to the Royal Economic Society. Not all of the book were such letters, but there are letters scattered throughout the book. But that was one, and it was because, you have a deadline. I needed something. That was on my mind, and I didn't have anything else to write about it. And I thought, I can't really do this. They don't have obituaries in the Royal Economic Society newsletter. And I thought, oh, hell, let's give it a go. And then when I was revising to do the book, that chapter almost got lost 3 or 4 times because I thought that this doesn't really belong here. But many people have said what you said, that they like that chapter. In fact, one commentator suggested that my next book be, 100 little biographies through which I could tell the story of the last 40 years of economics, which is not a bad idea.
It's not just not a bad idea. I think it's a very good idea. So I think if that chapter is anything to go by, we're destined to have quite a stunning book, really. Just one final question on economists and who you think they should learn from and talk to. One of the things about our Festival of Economics is we do try and encourage non-economists to speak with economists. And you talk in the book about economists really should be thinking more about and talking to philosophers. What would help their work in that way?
Well, I think a lot of philosophers, would laugh out of court any idea that the only thing that people are concerned about is money, or if you like, commodities or stuff, and that other things are much more important to people than stuff. And one of the things that philosophers understand is that relationships between people are very important too. And that's something, we're a very individualistic profession, which the libertarians, of course, are sort of completely individualistic. And these relationships between people are an important place where we're missing. So that, if a community is destroyed because the factory's shut, because the trade goes to Mexico or to Vietnam, it tears relationships between people apart. And that's what's really very bad. One of the things that's really very bad for people. And you can't give people money to restore a community. And, when Anne and I were working on Deaths of Despair, Durkheim, who's often regarded as the sort of founder of sociology, became a very important voice there. And he understood that very well. That, suicide is not to do with economic growth or economic decline. It's to do with economic disruption and people being torn out from the places where they grew up and losing their moorings and so on. So I think, philosophers are stronger on that. If you go back to Tony Atkinson, who you mentioned already, when I was first in Cambridge, when Tony was there in the 60s, and Amartya Sen was there, and we really did talk to philosophers. I was just a junior kid who was allowed to sit at the table drinking some of the things, but, we talked to, Amartya wrote a whole book about utilitarianism, and there were philosophers of all sorts around there, and it was a very lively place. And Jim Merlis was talking to Bernard Williams, for instance. There was just a lot of stuff going on. And, if you go back to the founders of economics, Adam Smith and Marx, they were all philosophers too. Yeah. So that's very important. Also, philosophers need to listen to economists too. I'm not sure I said that in that thing, but, and I talk a little bit about that in the book, that, philosophers have pushed us to give more money to developing countries without any understanding of what happens when we do that.
No, I think that was going to be my next question, actually, about the philosophers talking to economists. I'm grateful for you for saying that. Let's move on to you moving to America. You write in the book about you grew up in Scotland. You were not well off, poor, in fact. You immigrated to America in the early 80s, and you say in the book that you're still in awe about the opportunities and the promise, in a way, that the United States offers. But there's this dark side of inequality. There's little provision for those less fortunate and a harsh political environment. And that led to you have an ambivalence about the country that runs through the book. And you actually delayed citizenship for quite a long time, didn't you?
Yes, I did. Always have a plan B, as it were, which is, and I talk about why in the end I gave in on that. Once you have children and grandchildren who are settled here, it seemed very dangerous not to be a citizen here. But the dark side, I think it's, I wish in some ways the title of the book had been The Land of Inequalities with an S on the end, because it's much more than just wealth and income. The race issue in America is huge and looms much larger than it ever did in Britain when I was there. It's not that it's absent in Britain for sure, but it's different there. And that gets into so much of public policy and so much of issues. And, it is just worrisome, as you said, that there's so little care taken of people who are not succeeding. But, that's one thing. And you can make a good case, I suppose, for saying that, a thriving capitalism is one in which you really reward people who make new inventions. So I really do not have much problem with Jeff Bezos being rich, or with, Larry Page and all these guys, because they did things for us that are terrific. The worry is different than that. The worry is once these people, and now I take the names back, I'm not talking about Page or Bezos, once they become predators on everybody else, then we really do have a problem, and they're holding people down. And that's something that Anne and I wrote a lot about in the Deaths of Despair book, especially this awful healthcare system we have, which doesn't deliver anything and just charges arm and leg for it, and is really screwing up the labor market. And that, plus what you talked about, the fact that the big difference in some ways between Europe and the US from a fiscal point of view is Europe has a value-added tax, which means overall the tax burden is higher. And that value-added tax basically funds the welfare state, which here we don't have either. And so when you go through a period of disruption, as we've been going through with globalization and technical change, there's very little of that to cushion the consequences. So I think that's been an important part in the bad stuff that's going on here.
Well, I want to come back to health, because you talk about your own encounters with the healthcare system and illuminate some wider truths there. But just sticking with wealth inequality for the moment, and I take the point about inequalities, because you talk about a number of them in the book, one of which is health. But I'm very interested in this idea that when the widening of poverty and inequality began to happen, because I grew up as a late-ish baby boomer. I was right on the final end of the baby boom period. So I benefited to some extent from those kind of, upward mobility, free university education, the kind of end time of the 30 glorious years, when you talked about the age of watching grass grow in the book. Well, what really brought that to an end, would you say, that period? And we'll then come on to the more recent period.
I think historians are going to be arguing about that, for a really, really long time. But it's actually the decline in economic growth really set in somewhat before that. And it was only by 1970 that you begin to get this sort of falling away. A lot of historians would argue, a word I don't much like, but about neoliberalism. Yeah. And so there was certainly a revival of saying, okay, we need faster growth, we need freer markets, we're not rewarding enterprise enough. And okay, that'll generate a lot of inequality. And as I said before, in my book, The Great Escape, part of the story there is that, when things begin to pick up, and, I was thinking more of a very poor country that's been very poor for a long time, and you're beginning to get a few people who find a way to get rich or do something, then that's the start of what you want, which is everybody's going to get better in time, but you get inequality in the short run. And the big part of the public policy story is to stop that getting out of hand. And I think it did get out of hand, and once we got into the 80s and 90s and the great age of globalization, the financialization of the economy and so on. So, once you let that genie out of the bottle, it does nice tricks for you for a while, but eventually you have to pay a price.
Obama did recognize this, didn't he, as a problem, and he warned about growing income inequality and lack of upward mobility. And there's when you talk in the book about your visit to the White House, and he'd obviously read Anne's paper and your work more widely. But really,
Published.
I'm sorry?
He had read it. We went to the White House 5 days after that paper had been published, and he knew it down to the footnote.
Right. That's a remarkable piece of impact, actually, I think, which you should be very proud about.
You could say he was a better professor than he was a president. Some people would say.
But so Obama, recognized it and so on. And if I'm really rapidly going through the years here, but we had the pandemic, and some said that the child tax credit had helped reduce poverty and to a certain extent, but that's been reversed again, hasn't it, since?
I mean, the question is, if you give money to people and you count that and you define poverty by how much money people have, then any credit of that sort is going to reduce poverty. And if you take it away, it'll, increase poverty again. But the real concerns about that are there's some pretty good work, to the extent we know anything at all. Growing up in childhood is everybody grows up in childhood. Growing up in poverty suffers long-term consequences as a result of that. So, this could do real harm. And, there's a sort of streak of meanness, of cruelty in Washington, which doesn't seem to really care very much about that.
And the complexity is already, you've mentioned a few complex issues about this. The race issue is one thing, and the call for reparations linked to that, white working class problems, deaths of despair, what you do about foreign aid to try and help people elsewhere, which you write about in the book, but sometimes it's more effective to donate money in the United States because shelter is harder to find there than in some other countries, and so on. So you've got this very complex environment. What do you think the best thing we can do to begin to reverse inequality growing and to get mobility back again?
Well, I'm not sure that we want that. Mobility, I think, is important. Reversing inequality by itself would not be my main aim. My main aim, I'm very encouraged by, the Biden administration trying to hold big tech to account, for instance, because, that takes me back to the Great Escape. Philippe Aghion in Paris has also done wonderful work on this. You want this creative destruction to go on. You want people to get really rich in the public interest. But what you want to do is stop them putting moats up, which stop the next generation of people coming along behind them. And so that the growth continues instead of being stifled off by the people who succeeded at the last round. And history is full of stories like that, of emperors or kings who saw some entrepreneur who'd invented something new and saw them as threats and put them down. And so, you stopped seafaring for a few hundred years, or you choked off railways, or, there are lots of examples like that. And power is very dangerous, and it's sort of the power that comes with all that money that's really dangerous.
One area that I wanted to talk to you about in terms of mobility is linked to work we do on the future of cities and places. And we do also a biennial festival of the future city. And one of the things which comes across in the book is something we've been concerned about in this country, is the ability of people to move to areas where there might be more potential jobs, work, a better life, and so on, but they simply can't get there because house prices are too high. The cost of mobility is too high. And this is a United States problem, isn't it, as well?
Yes, very much so. And that's changed, because, NAFTA, for instance, which is now widely hated by everybody as far as I can see, was put in place in the Clinton administration and by, economists who are on my side of the movement rather than conservative economists. And they really thought it was a good idea. They anticipated that a lot of those jobs would be lost. And they thought it'd be a good idea for people to move from less successful cities to new successful cities and upgrade their work. And it just didn't happen. Now, the question is whether it was reasonable to suppose it happened, or was that just something that was in our models but wasn't really there in reality? if you look at what happened in Britain after the Industrial Revolution, I mean, when the handloom weavers lost their jobs, it took 50 years before real wages began to rise again. So it wasn't like, okay, they all moved to London and did something else. I mean, they didn't. They got poorer and poorer and poorer and died, and maybe their kids, or maybe Andrew Carnegie was a handloom weaver's kid who came to America and, got rich. But so I don't know, and I haven't studied that as to whether there was a lot of more mobility in the past. I suspect there was more. In fact, we know there was more mobility, but there's lots of things that have changed it. One is high prices in cities. That's another case where the educated elite have sort of controlled the cities and run them in sort of NIMBYist fashion and prevent the sort of housing construction that would allow that to happen. And it's clear that other cities around the world have done better than that, and so that it's really possible. The other thing that's happened is that it used to be that, you go back to the 70s, to the Trump Gloria, they weren't so Gloria for a lot of people. A lot of women didn't work, a lot of women were trapped at home. There was incredible racial discrimination and so on. But to come back to, if you now have two workers in a family, that makes it harder to move too, because you got to find two jobs instead of one. And so there's a lot of that stuff going on, which I think we understand a little bit of why it's hard for people to move.
I mean, one of the big problems we have now is not just high house prices, but the lack of social housing, council housing. I mean, my father was able to move to where we grew up because there was a provision of council housing there, and that gave him security of tenure. And a roof over your head for the long term. But there's lots of other things as well. As I mentioned, free university education was very important in my upbringing. Just one final question on this is about meritocracy, because at one point this was seen as the answer. Although Michael Young wrote his book as a satire or a warning more than as a blueprint, but Blair talked about meritocracy when he came into power, and others have done so. You really nail it though in your book, don't you, about just as Michael Sandel did in his.
I hope so. And you and I you said you were at the end of that generation. I was at the beginning of it, but we were very hopeful, and we thought this really was a brave new world, right? I mean, we could go to Oxford and Cambridge. I mean, we could, our parents didn't have to pay any fees. All that sort of good stuff. And it seemed like this was much better than the Duke of Omnium running everything. But, we saw the downsides, and it's clear that, and some people have argued that that was something that only happened once. And then, what happened was we took over, and we're just as greedy and as selfish as the people who were there before. And in fact, we're probably smarter because we were selected that way. And so we're much harder to replace meritocracy than the aristocracy that were there before.
Now, the next area I want to talk about is healthcare, because obviously the United States has a very different form of healthcare to us in this country. And you had personal encounters with the healthcare system, which you talk about in the book. I mean, it's staggering, really, when we read about your experiences of the healthcare system, just as when we read about the experiences of others in the American healthcare system, of the high cost, the concerns that this isn't delivering, good healthcare on a par with some other countries, the power of the lobby. But tell your story about the 2 hip replacements you had, because I think that illuminates the problems that exist there.
Yeah, well, there's good and bad to it. If you're comparing, my sister, who still lives in Scotland, is having her hip replaced, I think 2 weeks from now. And, she's forced into having it done privately, because otherwise she'd have to wait 3 or 4 years. And, she's not much younger than me, and that's a long time to wait and to suffer. So there's downsides to that too, whereas here in America, I could probably have my hip replaced tomorrow. if I needed it done again. In fact, I couldn't, because they'd have double workups before and so on, so that all sorts of people can make money along the way. But there are parts of that work, but the costs of it are really just outrageous. It's also true that I complain about how hard it was to find someone that I thought would do a good job on this. But I also, I think, admit pretty clearly that having come from Britain, you don't have that choice really, or I didn't then. So you were just sent by your GP along to whoever was the person who did this locally, and you couldn't really search around. So that's presumably, a good part of it. But the bad part of it is just this extraordinary money-making machine, especially in hospitals, which are enormous, and pharma companies. And I've noticed even the British press is now jumping up and down and saying, don't tax the pharma companies because we in Britain depend on them, which is, an argument that gets made all the time. But I just, given our health outcomes, we should not be paying this amount. And there's an amazing reluctance to talk about what throwing away, well, we spend 20% of GDP, perhaps 10% of it is wasted, what that does to the other things that we can't have. And a lot of the dysfunction in Washington is dealing with a deficit that's largely driven by this healthcare.
I mean, you've got an enormous lobby power there. Again, Obama tried to do something about this, and I thought the figures you gave for those who were opposed to Obamacare, 46%, as it was called, but only 25% were opposed to the Affordable Care Act, even though that was the official title of Obamacare, was quite significant, really.
I think this information has gotten worse since then. That people are getting their news from other people who are getting their news from God knows where.
Yeah.
And that really is a deep problem, I think.
I mean, just before we leave healthcare, I wanted to ask about race and healthcare, because you point out there about the numbers of people who aren't insured, but also the way the healthcare system is run on what you call apartheid lines.
Yes. So that's really one of the disgraces too. I mean, a lot of that is to do with residential segregation, in effect. So the residential segregation never really gone away in the United States. So there are places where, there are large communities of African Americans or Hispanic and whites where not very many people of color live. I think that's changing a little bit because this educational divide that Anne and I are working on is becoming very important even within the minority communities too. So, in places like Princeton, where we live, a very wealthy town, you'll find actually quite a lot of African Americans or Asians or of one sort or another who are living around where we live. It's just if you go to Trenton Railway Station and hang around down there, you won't find very many white people there.
One thing I wanted to do in the Festival of Economics is do a session on pensions, which is a subject I get increasingly interested in as I reach a certain age. And I couldn't get anyone interested in this, I have to say. And you talk about this in the book, how the subject is boring and people... but until you get to a certain age when people start to lose sleep over it.
Yeah, that's right. It's hard. It's very important from an economic point of view because the amounts of money are just enormous.
Huge.
And, I understand their discussions. People are now scared that the state pension is going to be means tested in Britain, for instance. And, that's a debate that is could be very poisonous.
Yeah. I mean, at the moment, they've got themselves in a bit of a mess because they agreed to the triple lock on pensions. And because wages have been going up so high, they're having to find a lot of money to match that as part of that. But of course, no party is going to touch it this side of a general election because the people who vote are often in receipt of those or about to be in receipt of those state pensions. So it's, but I think the bigger issue is the gaps between particularly younger people. And my fear with younger people is that they won't be able to afford a property. They'll be renting into their old age and they won't have been able to save enough for a decent pension. And I think this is storing up one of those big intergenerational problems, which you mention in the book as well.
Yeah, the climate change issue too. So, yeah, those are very, very big issues, and almost everything to do with these intergenerational transfers is just incredibly important to share the economy as a whole. And it's different there, I think. So the housing issue, which is clearly very much the forefront in Britain, is different here. Also, most people here have fixed rate mortgages, so we did not have here, when interest rates went up, the screams of pain on top of the cost of living crisis, which was also worse there too.
Yeah, and that's about to hit a lot of people here, I think, because their own terms come to an end soon, and they'll be at much higher interest rates. Well, just on productivity and innovation, I wanted to ask you particularly about the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is an odd title for something which is incredibly transformative, I think. What's your view on that? And will that help, overcome the kind of productivity slowdowns and declines that we've seen?
I hope so, and I'm very much in favor of it. The name is odd only because there was inflation, and that was a great title for it and helped get some votes that maybe you wouldn't otherwise have gotten. So it's a sort of standing joke. But there's been a huge amount of investment in new factories, new plants, and so on as a result of that. So people are pretty encouraged, it's the sort of thing Anne and I talk about in the Deaths of Despair book, and it seemed like this is different. It may or may not work, but it's certainly an attempt in the right direction. And, Joe Biden is out there today on the picket lines with the auto workers union. And, no president has ever done that before. And recent presidents would not have encouraged that. And, pushing for making the world an easier place for unions to grow back, I think is necessary. I mean, I, like you, lived in Britain when unions were not our favorite animals. On the other hand, without them, terrible things do happen to working class people because they're denuded of lots of protection. They get lower wages, they don't have people who look after their interests. There's no countervailing force in politics that takes that perspective. John Bew's book on Attlee, tells you that his cabinet in 1945 had 7 men in it who'd been active coal miners.
Yeah.
Who'd started their life at the coalface. And it's not that we want to reopen the mines, but the perspective of working class people is not exactly well represented in politics today on either side of the Atlantic. So all of those things would help. And I don't think Anne and I would claim you can't really trace these things through, but when we were working on the Deaths of Despair and talking about it, Janet Yellen was certainly one of our strongest supporters, who took every chance she could to promote the work and push the work. And, our boss here, C.C. Rice, was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for the first 2 years. So, our views are well known there. And it's not just us, but a lot of people are thinking, okay, the economists wouldn't have liked these things before. Now we got to try something different.
And I guess that, getting manufacturing back and getting it going in areas which have suffered is one of the answers to this. I wanted to ask you about the intellectual debate. The book talks about how, particularly higher education is looked down upon by some people, by some politicians. We have that problem here as well. It's not a new problem in the United States. You mentioned Richard Hofstadter's work in the 1960s. But you hope that this, once the wave of populism has waned, that people will see the value of HE, higher education and intellectual pursuits again. Is that right?
Well, I mean, as Hofstadter wrote, there are waves of this throughout American history, so I'm sure that will come and go. I want to qualify that a little bit, though. I spent my life as a university professor. So I'm not down on university education in any way at all. But the solution to the problems that Anne and I identified are not for everybody to go to college. And I think, what Michael Sandel wrote about and what I wrote about in the meritocracy chapter, what seems to be happening is this college degree has become a sort of passport, which enables you to enter a different sphere of life. And it's nothing to do with the college education actually being particularly productive or helping you in the job. Now, of course, you want your airline pilot to know how to fly an airplane, and you want your surgeon to know something about surgery. But it's not clear that getting a BA from a non-selective college in the poetry of Jared Manley Hopkins is really going to help you all that much in terms of your productivity in the workforce. So I think Europe has gotten this better. It's written somewhere in between, that there are many qualifications, and there are different qualifications for different jobs. And I think if we could move to that, that would be a very positive thing.
And I think one of the things we lost in this country for a long time was the apprenticeship, moving into a work, learning on the job. And I remember I've done a lot of work with the aerospace industry in Bristol. And one of the things they have to do is, once someone graduates with a relevant degree and goes to work for them, you have a scheme where they become apprenticeships again for 2 years, where they have to learn what the job really needs. So I think we've lost something with that apprenticeships work. You also talk about the impact on democracy and fears for the future of democracy, and this is something that concerns us a lot here as well. Just talk us through that. What are your fears for the future of democracy? And you have a very important election coming up as well.
We do. I mean, I think one of the things that democracy has to do is sort of deliver for everyone.
Yeah.
And if it only delivers for this educated elite, then we're in trouble, because this educated elite, apart from just the crude arithmetic of it, is only a third of the population. And the other 2/3 of the population is going to come for us with pitchforks. And, it used to be that both the majority of certainly a majority of Democrats and even the majority of Republicans thought education was a really useful thing. The universities are doing a good job. No longer at all. So they see us as oppressors in some way. And that really is bad for everybody. And, democracy is not going to work very well if, and I mean, I think this is where the death statistics are just terrifying, because, if you've got a 1/3 of the population whose life expectancy looks like Japan or Switzerland, and the other third that is beginning to look like, Africa, then you can't maintain a democracy like that for long.
And it's, it's similar in, this country as well, where you've got, say, parts of Bristol have 10 years less life expectancy than other parts of Bristol, and they're often almost next door to each other. It's a significant problem. We've had our own issues about the future of democracy here. Just a few other things that I just wanted to talk to you about quickly, about some of the things you look at in the book, and also in Deaths of Despair. We've talked about, things like healthcare reform. The minimum wage is a significant thing to look at, isn't it? And is a problem in the United States.
Yeah, no, the minimum wage has certainly been an issue. And I mean, that's one of the first, I put that in the first chapter because I think in some ways it's a good example of what, economics can do. And that story also shows, how much political relevance there is for a lot of economists' work, and how if you work on topics like that, you're going to get vilified and so on. But in this case, the science seems to have, really come through in the end. I think one of the most interesting things that's going on today is this idea that you might have a settlement in which there's an agreement to raise the minimum wage and inflation-proof it into the future, in exchange for tighter controls of immigration and forcing employers to actually verify that the people who work for them are legal immigrants. And, that would be a good deal in my view, actually. And it might break the logjam to some extent, but that's certainly something that we need to fix, because it's it's very disruptive right now.
And I wanted to ask you about immigration, because we've read recently, for example, how New York City is trying to deal with a large number of new arrivals in the city and has a financial responsibility to deal with them, but without any great level of federal support, if I'm reading the situation right.
Well, there's some federal support. So Biden has just put out an executive order which allows those people to work for a certain amount of time, which would help the situation in New York City, because right now they can't be gainfully employed. But there's another part of that I think is sort of interesting, is that this has made a lot of people on the left, the people in blue states, think about immigration as being a problem as well as just an asset. So that would also help what I was just talking about, in some coalition where people on both sides could get together over this issue.
The final solution I wanted to talk to you about was what you talk about in the book as looking at pre-distribution rather than redistribution. I remember Ed Miliband, when he was leader of the Labour Party, talked about pre-distribution, but it didn't really go very far. And I think it was some people saw him as one of those wonkish politicians who couldn't quite explain these things properly. I should say he's now in a very influential position in the current shadow cabinet, and is likely to be a minister, secretary of state after the next election. But talk us through pre-distribution.
Well, it's just that there's a lot of resistance, especially on the right, and with some reasonable justification, to having very high tax rates and in doing redistribution and, giving subsidies or tax credits or whatever. And, a lot of what we talk about in the book and what I think about is that, corporations, healthcare, whatever, are actually redistributing money upwards from ordinary people to the rest of us. So there's a sort of predation going on. Now, stopping that, you could call that pre-distribution, but it just means that, long before the tax system kicks in, you stop charging people so much, you pay them higher wages, you tackle monopsony, you stop fast food people keeping wages down, all that sort of stuff. You can call it pre-distribution. And I know it does sound sort of wonky. I'd forgotten that I'd used that word, but I would prefer to stop predation, and stop this upward redistribution, what Anne and I call Sheriff of Nottingham redistribution, the opposite of Robin Hood redistribution going on. And and it's a natural thought that when people say, well, we don't want more taxes, redistribution will cut incentives and all the rest of it, but there's a lot of redistribution going on. It's just happening in the wrong direction. And so if we could fix that, we'd be in much better shape altogether.
Well, I think it's one of those ideas that we need to discuss more of, and your book has a lot of ideas in for dealing with some of the many problems that we face. The Economics in America is highly recommended. It's out now from Princeton University Press. Thank you, Angus Deaton, for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I have enjoyed talking to you, and I hope people will buy the book and enjoy it.